Hey everybody, welcome to Culinary Characters Unlocked. I'm David Page. On this episode, a chef and restaurateur whose culinary repertoire ranges from Corsican to Israeli to Vietnamese and a whole lot more, and who's now running the palatial restaurant where his family celebrated big occasions when he was a kid. Here's Tyler Akin. Chef, how are you? Thanks for doing this.
I'm doing well, thank you. Good morning. As you can see, drinking my coffee here.
So you have cooked or own restaurants that feature the cuisines of Southeast Asia, North Africa, Israel, France, Corsica, Sardinia. At the end of a long, rough, tiring day, what is your go-to cuisine?
I think my ideal food is always sushi. Is what I try to come back to as often as possible, whether it's ordering from a reliable place or going out. I mean, that's number one in my world. It's a cuisine that I don't personally, I've never executed, and I don't know, the flavor profile speaks to me and it just feels light. It's a nice way to eat.
Do you think America is getting broader in its interest in cuisines of other places?
Yeah, 100%. I think that something as niche as what we're doing at Bastia, for instance, which I know we'll be discussing in a few moments, Corsican and Sardinian food, neither of those have had a lot of airtime. But I always feel when I come back to America from being abroad, one of the great benefits of living here is that we have really excellent iterations of almost any cuisine. By virtue of our population mix, you can really get a great version of almost anything.
Which raises the authenticity debate. And I hate the word authentic, but, the foodie who goes into the restaurant and declares it inauthentic. Mm-hmm. You cook various cuisines. Are you striving for the authenticity of the original or your interpretation of it?
On the whole, interpretational sort of approach, trying to understand the ethos and pathos of a culture and its cuisine and kind of putting that through your own filter, where along the way, your own memories with food kind of come into the picture and impart themselves on how you're framing this up. So I am not super hung up on that particular issue. I think that it's often an impediment to people doing what they can do best. And I think it's an impediment also to the conversation around the food frequently, where instead of just kind of judging something on the merits of what it is, it carries a lot of baggage around those topics.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware.
How early do you remember being interested in food as more than just, I'm hungry, I better eat this?
Yeah, I think around the time of the advent of Food Network, which my sister was absolutely obsessed with. I think that if you were a betting person in 1993, you may have put your chips on my sister becoming the chef as opposed to me, because it was a fixture in our household. It would be Molto Mario and Essence of Emerald and Grillin' and Chillin' and all those shows that were a curiosity to me, and I think exposed me to the notion that food was of interest. I think that was formative, just being in the background constantly. If it wasn't MTV, it was Food Network. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, was a really excellent cook who cooked these amazing meals. She's from Roanoke, so generally, Southern cuisine, but we would go down to Baltimore on holidays and Sundays and eat these amazing meals. So also a formative food moment for me.
How did you decide to pursue this as a career?
On the mid side of my early 20s, experiencing a bit of confusion about where I was heading. I dropped out of law school. I moved to DC. I was dating somebody whose family, had a background, and in the father's case was still very much involved in hospitality. I think that's where I was exposed to Bourdain, which I think is while it sounds cliched, a common thread among a lot of cooks and chefs of my generation. I definitely entertain the idea of academia as a path. I'd studied history and art history in college, and that was sort of like in the mix as well as a possibility. But
and then the light went off in your head as you were searching for something to do. Hey, maybe I'll try cooking.
Yeah, basically, we moved to DC, and I would go to these farmers markets organized by an organization called Fresh Farm. And there was this guy who would show up with like this absolutely crazy spread of artisanal breads and also beautiful, classical French pastries. But I was really intrigued by this bread. And, I asked him first if I could help him sell the bread. So I was under the tent at these markets helping him sell the bread. And I really wanted to learn how he was doing it. So I started commuting out to his bakery, which was in a renovated barn in the panhandle of West Virginia. I would spend days at a time out there baking and kind of help move the product back and forth into DC for sale. And he had a catering division of his company that did really cool food for some wealthy lobbyists who were based around DC. And as I moved from the bench, like shaping bread and the mixer, making dough, more into that knife work and sauce work and things like that really scratched an itch. And he encouraged me to go to culinary school. So that's sort of how that went.
So you did. And while you were there, you were staging at José Andrés restaurant, Minibar?
Yeah. I mean, when I think about that period, it was crazy. The culinary school, Académie de Cuisine, was on the last stop of the Red Line, the DC Metro. So it was like a 45-minute metro ride out from DuPont Circle where I was living. So we'd have to be there at 7, like getting on that train at 6:30, be in school until 3, get back on the train, head straight to Minibar and then later Comey. These days were like 19 hours typically, and then kind of like fall asleep in bed, hopefully not with like a beer on my chest. Which certainly happened a few times, and then do the same thing again the next day. So, that was a really cool experience. And a couple of those, although it was a very small team executing Minibar, I've sort of continued to cross paths with a couple of those guys over the years. So I was definitely a noob at that point and didn't bring a lot to their operation, but it taught me a lot.
Where'd you learn more? Cooking school or on the line?
That's an interesting question. I would say both. I would weigh them equally in importance. I've certainly worked with a lot of cooks and chefs who never attended culinary school, and through just sheer number of hours and osmosis, et cetera, they sort of, those fundamentals fall into place eventually. But I have always appreciated having operated from like that framework of a classical French foundation. But the nuts and bolts, the kind of like pedestrian tasks of being a cook, like, they can't be taught in culinary school. So it only takes you so far. And equally, I think like individual restaurants often don't get you to where you want to be. So I when I finished culinary school, I was working at a tasting menu restaurant in DC. And like by the time I left there, I think I was really good at working at that restaurant, but I was not a great cook by any means. It does take a little bit of movement around, different places to pick up what you want to learn.
And we'll be right back. You worked at several places. Comey with a Michelin star. You helped open Little Ciro, is it pronounced?
Yeah, Little Ciro, yes.
Which, bon appetit, included among the best 10 new restaurants in America. And then you go to Zahav in Philly. How'd that happen?
So Johnny Moniz, the chef owner of Comey and Little Ciro, was like a perennial nominee for James Beard Awards. One of the really cool things, the way that restaurant operated was, I know a lot of places make the claim that they consider their team their family. Like I've never encountered a place where I think that was more the case, like genuinely, to the extent that they would take all of the line cooks to the Beard Awards, which these are $500 tickets and closing the restaurant for a couple days. And I was at the Beard Awards and Mike Salmanov was, I think, serving food like in the common area this is when it was in New York. I had an interest in moving back closer to home in Philly, which was like the big city for me growing up. So approached him. He expressed an interest given where I was at the time. Another year passed. And then I kind of made the decision to take the leap, walked in there with a resume and they immediately knew where I was coming from and kind of had an offer on the table the next day.
To cook Israeli food?
Ostensibly, yeah. I mean, and more so because I wanted to be at a great restaurant. It was not my goal per se to cook Israeli food.
What is Israeli food?
I think that's the interesting thing about it is it's the food of a diaspora that sort of reconvened as Jewish people for a variety of reasons over time, spread out, throughout Europe and North Africa and the Levant, et cetera. And then when the state of Israel was formed and many of them came back, they brought these cuisines together into this really cool, interesting new melting pot, almost a reverse melting pot in a way from how we normally consider it, or an inverted one. I found that really interesting that on the same menu, you may find kind of Eastern European, Ashkenazi references as you would Sephardic food of Iberia or North Africa, right? Like in one moment, you may be plating Yemenite stew, and the next you might be plating mujadra or some kind of like beet dish that's rooted in Eastern Europe. So I found that super interesting and picked up a lot of techniques and learned a lot about like new ingredients I hadn't encountered.
And one day you look up and say, time for my own place. How's that happen?
It was my goal moving to Philadelphia to open my own place. And I needed a job, of course, and Zahav was high on my list. When I made that exploratory trip to Philadelphia, kind of checking out neighborhoods I might want to live in, kind of cold dropping my resume. It's really interesting that only 15 years ago, somebody who had ambitions to cook at one of the top restaurants in a city like Philadelphia, or any other city for that matter, there might be like 4 or 5 places that you were really keen to be considered at. Now it's unbelievable, the proliferation of great restaurants over the last decade. It's like, if I were in my shoes now coming into Philadelphia with resumes in hand, there might be 20 places that I'd be excited about dropping my resume to. So maybe 30, maybe 40.
I hear so much about the death of independent restaurants, the death of fine dining, the inability to hire people. Mm-hmm. Is all that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. I just think that as the family trees of those restaurants, the kind of tier A aspirational restaurants that somebody coming up would want to cook at, as those family trees have grown and spread, those talents have ideas and ambitions of their own, and they open places, and those decisions are not informed by, the labor pool is still the same as it was 10 years ago, effectively. With each one of us kind of breaking off to open a thing, we're diluting the pool to an extent. But I don't think anybody's consciously feeding into that pattern. It's just a fact. And I don't think the sky is falling. Obviously there was a moment, an extended difficult moment during the pandemic where the sky was falling, and the things that you just said were absolutely the case. But it's always been a hard business. I don't think there's anything unique about 2025 in that regard, but it does feel like it's getting a little bit harder all the time. But there are also more cooks and more chefs who have ideas, and a more sophisticated dining public who is eager to try new things. So these like dynamics kind of work in opposition to each other and do not complement each other always, but this is the hand that we're playing.
And amid that hand, you say to yourself, it's the riskiest business on earth, the easiest way to go bankrupt. I'm going to open a restaurant. What'd you do?
I leased a shoebox of a space that was not zoned for a restaurant use. So, kind of had to navigate the process of getting a variance and going in front of the zoning board of adjustment, and all with a very tiny opening budget that a couple partners helped out, but this was effectively like as modest of an operation as you can imagine. There was no hood. When we opened, we had 3 induction burners, and that was it. We supplemented that with like a tabletop sort of small convection oven. It was the size of a large toaster, and maybe like 4 more induction burners over time as our volume grew and we added more things to the menu. But it was modest would be an understatement. I mean, it was barely a restaurant, but the food was good and people really loved it. And within a year or two, we were finding ourselves like on the Eater 38 list of essential restaurants in Philly. And somehow this little place resonated with a lot of people, and it did well enough for me to, continue to grow into other opportunities.
What'd you serve there?
It's closed now. So it was called Stock, and initially it was really like more specifically Vietnamese. We were serving pho and a vegan version, and a couple salads, and we began over time to veer into Southeast Asian regional cuisine generally.
Why did you choose that kind of cuisine in the first place? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to open a small restaurant. I'm going to take a risk. You could do burgers. You could do tacos. Why'd you go Southeast Asian?
A few reasons, like it was a commercial calculation. Like I lived in Fishtown, which was a very different neighborhood then than it is now. It was at the very beginning of its trajectory, into becoming like a neighborhood that had interesting restaurants that felt contemporaneous and that had a lot of people living in it who had discretionary income to go out to eat. It was more of like a creative neighborhood at that point, I would say, on the whole, like artists and designers and things like that. Whereas I think now it's begun to veer more into the professional population. It felt exciting. It felt a little bit like the frontier still in terms of dining. There was no concept like this in the neighborhood. And having opened Little Cerro, which was, we served Isan food, Northeastern Thai food, which obviously has a lot of big differences to Vietnamese cuisine. But I learned a lot about how to work with those ingredients that are common between the two cuisines, whether it's like balancing salt and acid and sweet through palm sugar and fish sauce and lime juice or rice vinegar. Like those balances were sort of fresh in my memory, having gone through the Little Cerro opening, just a couple of years prior.
You literally taught yourself? I mean, did you travel in Southeast Asia? How much did you know about these foods before you said, hey, I'll make them?
Yeah, I spent several months with a friend of mine in that region after graduating from college. We went over there and ate as much like locals as we possibly could and really immersed ourselves in the street food and the food generally. I'd fallen in love with pho. It was something that I ate all the time outside of work on days off and began to cook like really earnestly out of Charles Fahn's book, the Slanted Door Chef, who, rest in peace, died very recently. But yeah, largely self-taught. There's a lot of scholarship and commentary that sort of roots pho in French soup making traditions. And in my mind, it was a matter of playing with some new spices, and ultimately you're making a stock, which I felt like I basically knew how to do.
Back in a moment. Your next venture was Your next venture was
Resipsa.
No, hold on. I married my lawyer. Your next venture was Reps Ipsa Cafe, which I assume is a nod to your legal, because res ipsa loquitur, I guess, is the legal term for the thing is what it is.
Yep. It seemed like it was a good way to announce that we were going to sort of do things how we wanted to.
And what'd you serve there? What kind of food?
Yeah. So it was an all-day cafe. It was in partnership with Mark and Mark from Reanimator Coffee Roasters in Philadelphia. We had a beloved breakfast sandwich that was inspired by the Wawa Sizzly in part.
For those who don't live around here, I'm on the Jersey Shore. Wawa being our beloved convenience store, but explain the dish, please.
Yeah, so it was kind of like a mashup of the two ideals for breakfast sandwiches that I had growing up, one being Wawa, one being McDonald's. Okay, so at Wawa, you can walk up to the little heat box next to the register and like grab one of 8 different varieties of breakfast sandwich at any given point. So we were making English muffins in-house and making sausage in-house. And ultimately, it was a modern Sicilian food concept as manifested in the dinner program. Some influences into that daytime offering. So we had like, Asiago fresco and a salsa verde on the breakfast sandwich. It was a frittata instead of like a fried egg. So that sandwich really gave us a lot of wind in our sails for the daytime, but it was ultimately the dinner, I think, that made waves. And by the time we closed Res Ipsa on the eve of the pandemic, we had climbed to number 6 on the Philly Mag list of 50 best restaurants in Philly. And this was like a very modest, very small, 32 seats, no liquor license. So BYO, small kitchen, something, it was a project that I was very proud of. And, we had a super talented chef, Michael Ferrari, who's now at Irwin's in South Philadelphia, who was, kind of discovering his voice along the way. It became a really special place that was certainly beloved.
And it was the pandemic that closed you down?
Yeah.
So you rebound in your hometown.
Yeah, and that project, it was supposed to open like Mother's Day 2020. It's called Le Cavalier. It's at the Hotel DuPont, which is a kind of Gilded Age luxury hotel built by the DuPont family and Raskob, actually, the gentleman who built the Empire State Building, among other things. This hotel was built to rival the grand hotels of London and Paris and New York. The DuPont family was at its peak of wealth and influence at the time and had bankers and industrialists visiting Wilmington, and they wanted somewhere to put those people up respectably and impress them. And so the city of Wilmington was blessed with this incredible property that had a restaurant called the Green Room for the first 105 years of the hotel's operation. It's this absolutely beautiful, soaring ceilings. Hundreds of artisans and craftspeople from Italy and France were brought over to, decorate the hotel and the dining room as well. We inherited this absolutely gorgeous, singular place that had taken on a lot of different identities over its century, from the early 20th century standard of fine dining, which is a kind of continental American approach, into sort of mid-century cuisine through the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you can look at these old menus still. The archives have been donated to this museum here in Wilmington, and you can look at these old recipes and menus and see how the place evolved. It was very much not static over time. It went from kind of I'm not sure how to describe it, but seeing things like thermidors and, in the early days, and then into kind of Oysters Rockefeller. And then, there was an era in the 80s and 90s where a whole regime of Swiss chefs and front of house managers came in, and it became very classical. And the menus, took on cursive typefaces. So it was a lot of different things over time. But we reimagined it as a brasserie, removed the tablecloths. We added some features to kind of break up the dining room a little bit, because when we started on the renovation, it was just a sea of tables for four in the old grand style, where there were no walls breaking up the space or anything like that. So that was a really cool project to work on in so many ways. I'm still involved in it. I'm headed there right after this call, and it's taken its place in the community, I think, as a beloved restaurant in its own right.
Do you remember it from your childhood? Did you ever eat there as a kid?
Yeah, I found to be sort of stifling, overly formal, not something that necessarily resonated with me, but the architecture was something that you couldn't fail to respond to. And it still is just such a grand, impressive space to be in. I
will now reveal my ignorance. I'm looking at the menu, and you have a dish, cassarece?
Well, that's a pasta. And it's not uncommon, so while our framework there conceptually is brasserie fare that is influenced by the flavors of southern France and North Africa. So reaching into some of the places where culinary exchanges develop between France and its colonies, for instance, our cocktail program has always been very much influenced by the New Orleans cocktail tradition.
Which is basically lying on the floor of the bar and having people step over you.
Yeah, although we don't experience that much unless it's 2 a.m. after a wedding in the Gold Ballroom. But it is often the case that a brasserie will have a pasta on the menu.
Oh, I'm not questioning the authenticity of the menu. I'm interested in the dishes, and I have no idea what cassarece is. Is it extruded?
Yeah, it is. It's a little, it's almost like a little 2-thread braid. Yeah, so it's pretty toothsome shape.
You've got what? Lamb tagine. Okay, so that
yes.
Mediterranean, North African influence. It's interesting to see hummus and escargot on the same menu. Not that they don't belong together. It's a lovely menu.
No, for sure. And as far as the hummus goes, that is, in a perfect world, that dish would be titled pois chichade, which is what it is. The people of Provence do so many things with chickpeas, and making their own version of hummus is just one of them. Whereas a hummus tahina that we may recognize as something great in a Middle Eastern restaurant otherwise is basically just cumin and chickpeas and tahina. In our case, in the case of pois chichade, which is the Provençal version of hummus, like you're sweating a whole bunch of vegetables, celery, carrots, onion at the beginning of building the hummus. And then you're pureeing it, so it has this kind of like vegetal body to it. So while it says hummus on the menu, it's truly more of a pois chichade.
I've never heard of that dish. This is a very informational conversation for me. Okay, so you open that, it's rocking and rolling. Now let's get to your latest new venture, Bastia. Which is?
Bastia is a 70-seat restaurant in a brand new boutique hotel called Hotel Annabelle, which is in the heart of Fishtown. Like, we're not on the commercial corridor. We're sort of tucked into the neighborhood. Really, really beautiful reimagination of this property that had functioned for actually almost 300 years as a home for indigent women was how it was built. That property in its final years had become a generalized retirement home. And it was purchased by current ownership, my partners, in order to be a boutique hotel. So we have 50 rooms. We have Bastia, which is the kind of like headliner restaurant. And we have Coletta, which is a lounge adjacent to Bastia.
What is the culinary ethos of Bastia?
We hang our hats on Corsica and Sardinia, the neighboring islands.
Let me stop you right there. So you're going to open a new restaurant, and you say, you know what America needs? Corsican food. You know what Philadelphia is going to flock to? Those old Sardinian specialties.
Yeah.
I don't think 99.9% of Americans can tell you what Corsica is.
I think that's true. I think best case scenario, there may be like a vague memory that, that's where Napoleon's from. And that's about it. It is a rugged, lightly touristed, especially by non-Europeans, island that, while it's a French territory, a French state, it kind of very much similar to Sardinia has a big chip on its shoulder where they don't fully identify as French. They identify as Corsican first and foremost, and really active like separatist movement on the island. It really is its own thing. And while like modern Corsicans are generally speaking French, it was also ruled by the Genoese for several hundred years. So there's this really strong undercurrent of Italian influence in the cuisine. I just found it super interesting when I started diving deep into it several years ago.
Why did you start diving deep into it several years ago?
So John Seibert, who's the chef owner of Tail Up Goat, which is a Michelin-starred DC restaurant. John was the sous chef at Comey when I was there. So he was really the person who was like at the earliest stage of my career, shaping my work habits and my standards and many of my techniques.
What was the cuisine at Comey?
So Comey was named after the beach on the island, the Greek island of Chios, where the chef owner Johnny Moniz's family was from. So Comey is a beach on the island of Chios. It was largely Greek, but more generally Mediterranean. There would always be pasta dishes on the menu. And of course, there are like some pasta traditions in Greece, but I would say that the concept encompassed Italy in a lot of ways as well, and kind of like the Aegean islands generally. So John had moved on to open Tail Up Goat. I had invited him up to cook a collaboration dinner at Le Cave in Wilmington. And we were trying to figure out like some common ground to collaborate on, and something that felt novel and would interest us both. So we landed on Corsica because Tail Up Goat's like their concept is like island food broadly, which gives them a really big sandbox to play in. So it felt like somewhere with Le Cave, obviously being a French brasserie and Corsica being an island and Tail Up Goat, having that very much central to their concept. It felt like something that we could kind of drive in on. And the dinner never ended up happening. But in the course of planning the dinner and getting ready for it and like starting to map out menus, I started like amassing every book about Corsican cuisine that exists in the English language and French. And for the next several years, just like went deep on it.
And why did you add Sardinia?
Sardinia, because I wanted to get back to serving pasta. Sardinia, while like very much its own thing, does have a lot of commonalities with Sicilian food. It's not a great leap from one to the other. Whereas Ipsa no longer existed, I really wanted to get back to those brighter flavors than Corsica was going to offer. One reductive way to sort of describe the difference here is like in Corsica, they eat bread with butter. In Sardinia, they eat bread with olive oil. You've got a brighter, in a way, like lighter cuisine. Often, Corsica is super mountainous. Within a few kilometers of the coast, you're kind of climbing these peaks, many of which are taller than any mountains we have in North America. And for centuries, people didn't live on the coast. both because of like raiding pirates and countries seeking to assert dominance on the island, but even more so because of the malaria that was widespread along the coast. So the folks lived in the mountains, and because of that, it took on this almost like alpine profile. I'd say the food of Corsica is generally cozier. You have a lot of lentils and chestnuts and mushrooms and pork and veal, charcuterie and cheeses that resemble things that you might find like in the low alpine areas of Switzerland, Italy, France. So they just seem like really nice counterpoints to each other that would help me kind of navigate the seasons here in the Mid-Atlantic and what we have on hand.
Well, what are the representative dishes? I'm looking at your menu here. Quail eggplant with ratatouille, agrodolce, which is
like sweet and sour.
And fennel citrus salad. That's an entree?
That is an entree. That's our vegetarian entree on the menu currently. That dish, I think, represents well how we try to fuse these cuisines at times. The quail eggplant being in Sicily for a very long time, the more impoverished people in Sicily could not afford to eat game birds, whereas the aristocrats were eating game birds every night. So in order to, emulate that experience, they would take eggplants and score them all the way up the length of the eggplant and then deep fry them, and they kind of fly out and sort of give the appearance of feathers. So the way we prepare the ratatouille is almost in like a caponata style, where there's a good amount of vinegar and honey. And, I wanted something bright and crisp on the dish because there's a lot of softness otherwise. So we put a fennel citrus salad. But there's another dish on the menu that I think is really like representative of how we try to merge these cuisines at times. Until recently, we were serving malloreddus, which is like the most traditional beloved pasta shape in Sardinia. They're a tiny little semolina dough gnocchi, so no potato. They're about, let's say, like a quarter by a half inch at most, like more so like a quarter by a quarter inch. Tiny little gnocchi. We have counted them. We serve about 105 of them in a portion, hand rolled. And we were serving that with a wild boar and chestnut ragu. Very much like those are two central ingredients in Corsica is wild boar and chestnut.
That's the food of poverty, because wild boar you could shoot and eat. Am I correct?
Exactly. And chestnuts are ubiquitous in Corsica because by mandate, I believe it was in the 18th century, every household had to plant a chestnut tree, a lemon tree, and I believe it was a fig tree. As a result of that, chestnuts are everywhere. They've not faced the blight that we have in North America with our chestnut trees, so they're still very much everywhere.
I'm fascinated by this salt-baked beets with Calabrian chili, Marcona almonds, and ricotta. That sounds fantastic. Are the beets sweet?
They have that underlying sweetness of a beet, but they kind of take this like subtle seasoning from within when you salt bake them. We season that ricotta we worked with Lior Lev Sarkaz, who owns Le Boite, a spice blender in New York City, to create a blend that is meant to evoke like the maquis, the scrubland that covers much of Corsica, which when people describe the sensory experience of being in Corsica, they're usually talking about the maquis. It's covering like 70% of the island. And basically it's like low waist level wild sages and calamint and immortelle and these kind of exotic wild herbs that are hard for us to get our hands on. But Lior was able to put this blend together. So we seasoned the ricotta with that and some preserved orange and lemon. We make a gastrique with Calabrian chili. So it's kind of, again, like that sweet and sour note.
Where do you get these ideas?
I don't know. There are times that the ideas are organic, almost from thin air. And those moments aren't like, you can't create them.
I think you have to have a certain something innately to be a good chef. Do you have to have that something inside you from birth?
I don't think so. I mean, I was not a particularly like artistic person. And to me, it requires some discipline to make the space for creative thinking. I get really caught up like a lot of people do. Like, I have two kids and I'm helping to run multiple businesses. And I think like unless you are really disciplined about saying like, I'm going to block these 2 hours just to be with myself. And maybe the first 20 minutes of those 2 hours are like paging through a book and, reminding yourself of an idea that you wanted to riff on. And it may not even be a cookbook. It might be some history book or something that transports you to the place that you're trying to channel to the plate. And from there, in your mind, I guess you begin to game out like the possibilities and start to test things and see where it lands. But I feel in a way like I've only become fully formed as a chef in the last several years. Even after all this time, like I find myself feeling more robust in my thinking than I ever have before and confident at the moment.
Do you think the dining crowd is having a similar evolution?
Yes. I think that there's far more receptiveness to new and novel things that 10 or 15 years ago would have been like, that's insane. Why would I go to a Corsican restaurant when I can go to Le Bec Fin? There were, the kind of silos of cuisine were pretty narrow and rigid. And I think that this fragmentation, as again, these family trees of chefs have spread out, is super exciting. And it's given us so many different ways to eat. It's fantastic.
Predictions for the future?
I can't imagine that pattern stops. People are narrowing in on these regional and sub-regional cuisines and making a run of it. I would love to see more vocational training of, young cooks. Like I think that the Pro Start programs, a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, runs the Pro Start program at a vocational high school here in Delaware. Of course, like there are kids who are in that program because they don't want to do electrical or plumbing, and it's just sort of what they fall into. But there are some who are amazing and they're going to do things. I'd love to see more exposure to cooking. I think a lot of these like home ec programs, et cetera, have disappeared, have lost their funding. The facilities have been closed. And it's sad because, as a result, like people are not trying to do it themselves, which I think is equally important. People, because they don't know how to cook as much anymore, maybe are more inclined to go out, which is great for us restaurateurs. But speaking for a society, like it would be wonderful if we doubled down on that.
That's good advice. Chef, it's been an absolute pleasure meeting you. I very much appreciate your doing this.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Tyler Akin on Culinary Characters Unlocked. I'm David Page, and I'll see you next time.